The coffee on my desk had gone cold again, which meant I'd been staring at the same spreadsheet for 40 minutes without actually seeing it. That was the thing about working on the 41st floor of Hargrove Capital's Chicago headquarters. The view was spectacular enough to swallow your attention whole if you let it. Lake Michigan in November looked like hammered pewter, flat and cold and endless. I'd learned to position my monitor so my back faced the windows. Less distraction, more productivity. That was the kind of calculus I'd spent 18 months perfecting. My name is Tessa Ward, and I was the most visible person in that building. Invisible because I was 31 years old, and my title was Senior Financial Analyst, which sounds impressive until you understand that my actual job was to make sure that Callaway Hargrove, founder, CEO, and primary reason the financial press kept running out of superlatives, never walked into a meeting without knowing exactly what the other side wanted before they opened their mouths. I prepared his briefings. I cross-referenced his data. I caught the discrepancies that his associates missed because they were too busy being intimidated to actually read the numbers. Visible because apparently I was the only person on staff he'd kept longer than a year. Word. His voice came through the intercom with that particular clipped quality that meant he'd already been thinking about something for 2 hours and had decided I needed to think about it too. Immediately. The meridian projections. Walk me through your assumptions on the revenue curve. I didn't look up from my keyboard. Which version? I sent 3. A pause. Not long, maybe 2 seconds, but with Callaway Hargrove, 2 seconds of silence carried more weight than most people's full sentences. The aggressive scenario. Page 11. The curve assumes 18% organic growth in Q2, which I think is optimistic, given their churn data from the past 4 quarters. I flagged it in the margin notes. The conservative model on page 14 is more defensible. Another pause. Then, you think I should lead with the conservative model in a pitch meeting. I think you should lead with the aggressive model and have the conservative one ready when they push back. Which they will. Harrington's team always pushes back on Q2. Something that might have been a sound of approval filtered through the speaker. Might have been. With him, you learn to read the absence of criticism as a compliment. Come in, please. I closed the Meridian file, straightened the folder I'd already prepared. Because I'd learned 18 months ago to prepare for every possible version of every possible conversation. And walked through his office door. Callaway was standing at the floor-to-ceiling windows I'd trained myself to ignore, his back to me. He was the kind of man who occupied space differently than other people, not through physical size, though he was tall enough, but through some quality of attention that made a room arrange itself around him. His suits were always charcoal or navy, never black, and he wore them the way people wear things they've stopped thinking about, because the decision was made so long ago, it became automatic. I'd spent approximately 400 working days in his orbit, and I still wasn't entirely sure what I thought of him. The churn data, he said without turning. You ran the longitudinal comparison yourself, cross-referenced with their public filings and the 2 analyst reports. Meridian probably thinks we haven't seen. And your conclusion? This was the test. He did this regularly. Asked about decisions I'd already made correctly, watched to see if I'd second-guess myself or defend my work. I'd learned, around month 3, to defend it. They've been losing mid-market clients at a rate that their new enterprise wins don't fully offset. The revenue curve looks healthy on the surface because the enterprise contracts are larger, but the volume tells a different story. If Harrington's team runs the same analysis, and they will, they'll use it as leverage to negotiate the valuation down. You should get there first. He finally turned. His eyes were this particular shade of dark gray that the building's lighting made look almost blue sometimes, and he had the habit of looking at people like he was reading something written behind their face. Junior associates tended to start talking too fast when he looked at them that way. I'd stopped talking too fast around month 4. Prepare a 1-pager, he said. The churn argument framed as due diligence transparency rather than weakness. Have it on my desk by 9 tomorrow, already drafted. It's in the folder, tabbed in green. Something shifted in his expression, a fraction of something that, on anyone else, I might have called a smile. Thorough as always, Ms. Ward. I turned to leave. His voice stopped me. The flowers in the lobby this morning. He said it carefully, like he was testing the weight of each word. Security flagged them as addressed to you. My hand tightened on the folder. I hadn't ordered anything, hadn't been expecting anything. I'm not aware of any delivery. Regardless, they're at the reception desk. White roses. A rather significant arrangement. His tone had gone deliberately neutral, which somehow made it louder. Evidently, someone thinks highly of you. Heat moved up the back of my neck, but I kept my voice even. I don't know who would send flowers to my office. Everyone has admirers, Ms. Ward. Some are simply more organized about it. I didn't know what to do with that sentence, so I left it where it was and returned to my desk. The arrangement was, as described, significant. 3 dozen white roses wrapped in cream paper with a black ribbon, sitting at the reception desk like they'd claimed the territory. No card in the outer wrapping. A small envelope tucked inside, which the receptionist, a pleasant woman named Sasha, reported had only a short message. For the woman who makes complicated things look simple. DD. I didn't know anyone whose name started with D who would send me roses at work. I knew a Derek in accounting, but we'd exchanged maybe 12 sentences in 18 months, and none of them had involved anything that could generously be called warmth. That afternoon, my colleague from Risk Analysis, a sharp and relentlessly curious woman named Phoebe, appeared at my desk with poorly concealed excitement. "Tell me everything," she said, settling into the chair across from me uninvited. "I heard they're white roses. White is more romantic than red, you know. Red is too easy. White takes thought. I appreciate the floral semiotics, but I genuinely don't know who sent them." "Okay, but..." She leaned closer. "The whole floor is talking about how Hargrove personally came down to reception to look at them." I went very still. "That's not accurate," Sasha said. He walked through the lobby around 11, which he never does because he takes the private elevator, and he stopped and looked at the arrangement for what Sasha described as, quote, "a weirdly long time," end quote. I thought about his carefully neutral tone when he'd mentioned them, the way his jaw had shifted when I'd said I didn't know who sent them. "He's security conscious," I said, which was true. He probably wanted to know why there was something unvetted in the building. "Sure," Phoebe said, in a tone that meant she absolutely did not think that was the reason. After she left, I found myself thinking about those roses more than I should have. White roses. The deliberate choice, rather than the obvious one. Someone who'd thought about what I might notice. The afternoon carried on with unusual tension. Calloway called me into his office twice for things that could have been emails. The second time, I caught him watching the door to the reception area through the glass wall of his office, his expression closed and unreadable. At 5:30, his head of security, a quietly formidable man named Edmund, who had the energy of someone who'd seen everything and filed it all away for later, appeared at my desk. "Mr. Hargrove has asked that you take the arrangement with you this evening." Edmund's voice was perfectly professional. "He'd prefer it not remain in the building overnight. That's unnecessary. They can stay at reception." He was specific. I looked at Edmund for a moment, trying to read something in his face. As usual, Edmund gave me nothing. I nodded, gathered my things. When I reached the lobby, Calloway was already there. I hadn't expected that. In 18 months, I'd never seen him in the lobby at 5:30. He existed, in my understanding of the world, on the 41st floor and in conference rooms and in the back seats of town cars with his phone pressed to his ear. Not here, under the building's main lights, standing next to a floral arrangement with the particular stillness of someone who had made a decision and was waiting to enact it. He looked at the roses. His expression was controlled in that way that somehow communicated exactly what he was controlling. "Have these sent back," he said quietly to the security guard near the desk. The guard hesitated. "Sir, I'm aware of who they're addressed to." His voice didn't rise. It never rose. "Return them." Something hot moved through me. I set my bag down deliberately. "With respect, Miss Hargrove." My voice was steady, even though my heart was doing something entirely unprofessional. "They were sent to me. If anyone's making decisions about them, it should be me." He turned to face me fully, and the expression on his face was nothing I'd seen in any of our hundreds of professional interactions. Not the assessing look, not the almost approval, not the neutral focus. Something raw and barely managed, like he'd reached the edge of whatever compartment he normally kept this particular thing locked inside. You want to keep an anonymous gift from a stranger. I want to make my own choices. I held his gaze, aware of every person in the lobby suddenly finding somewhere else to look, and I'd like to understand why you're so concerned about flowers. The silence stretched. He closed the distance between us until I had to tilt my head slightly to maintain eye contact, and I could smell his cologne, cedar, something dry and precise. And underneath that, something that was just him, just the specific gravity of the man I'd spent 18 months learning to read. You work for me, he said, low enough that only I could hear. What happens to you within the scope of your workday is something I take seriously. Anonymous deliveries are a security concern. That's all this is it? The words came out before I'd decided to say them, bold in a way that surprised even me. His jaw tightened. For a moment, I actually thought he might say it. Whatever the real thing was. Whatever was burning at the edges of his expression. Instead, Edmund, have the flowers sent Miss Ward's home address, and I want a security report on the sending florist by morning. He left. His footsteps were quiet on the marble, deliberate and measured, and he didn't look back. Edmund appeared at my elbow. This, he said very quietly, as he carefully gathered the roses, is Mr. Hargrove being restrained. You should know that. I rode home in the town car he'd insisted on 6 months ago, when a client meeting had run late, and the L had been suspended due to an incident. He'd never unilaterally canceled the arrangement. I'd stopped arguing about it 3 months in. My apartment in Lincoln Park was exactly sized for one person who worked too many hours and owned too many books. The roses looked disorienting on my kitchen table, like something from a production budget that didn't match the rest of the set. I found the actual card tucked between stems. I've been wanting to introduce myself for some time. You probably don't know me yet, but I know your work, and I find you remarkable. I'd like to buy you dinner. Declan Shaw, we knew that name. Declan Shaw, Shaw Meridian Partners, the company we were about to pitch. My phone rang while I was still processing that. Calloway's private line, the one he'd given me for situations requiring immediate judgment calls. Did the arrangement arrive safely? It did. I paused. There was a card this time, Declan Shaw. Silence. Then, with a quality I couldn't immediately name, don't respond to any communication from him. Not yet. Forward me everything, Calloway. His name came out before I'd decided to use it. First time I'd ever said it rather than Mr. Hargrove. He didn't correct me. We'll talk in the morning, he said. First thing, lock your door. He hung up before I could answer. I forwarded the card photo, checked my door, already locked, and stood in my kitchen with the white roses, filling the room with something that felt, increasingly, less like romance and more like a warning. My phone buzzed again. Unknown number this time. I hope you liked them. I've heard a great deal about you, Tessa. I think we'd have a lot to discuss over dinner. Some of it might surprise you. The use of my first name made something cold move down my spine. Another text, moments later. It's about Hargrove, and what he's been doing with money that isn't entirely his to move. I think you deserve to know the truth about the man you've spent 2 years protecting. I stared at those words for a long time. Then I called Calloway back. He texted me, I said when he picked up immediately, like he'd been holding the phone. He's making claims about you. Financial misconduct. The silence on the other end was the most controlled silence I'd ever heard, which was saying something. Don't engage, he said. I'm sending Edmund, I know it's not necessary. I'm sending him anyway. And then, before he hung up, Tessa, my name. The first time he'd said it, not Miss Ward, not Ward, but Tessa. And the way he said it sounded like something he'd been not saying for a long time. Don't believe what he's telling you. Not yet. Give me until morning to explain. Morning felt very far away. Edmund arrived in 12 minutes. By the time I'd made tea I wasn't going to drink, the texts had stopped. The roses sat on my table, no longer beautiful. White and elaborate and deliberate, a hook disguised as a gift. I met Calloway at 7 the next morning, in the private conference room on the 41st floor. The one that required a key card and had no exterior windows. He was there before me, which he never was for anything. He looked like he'd slept badly or not at all, and there was a folder on the table that he'd clearly been reading when I walked in. Declan Shaw. He didn't sit. He stood with his hands braced on the table, looking at the folder. His family's firm, Shaw Meridian, is one of our potential acquisition targets, as you know. What's in your briefing materials is accurate. Legitimate asset management. Solid if not spectacular performance. What's not in the briefing materials is the reason his father has spent the last 3 years trying to negotiate a deal with me and failing. He pushed the folder toward me. Inside were documents I recognized the format of: internal correspondence, transaction records. 4 years ago, Shaw Sr. and I were in preliminary talks about a co-investment structure. A real estate fund targeting underserved commercial corridors on the south and west sides, neighborhoods that major capital had been avoiding for decades. His voice was even. I walked away from those talks when it became clear that the fund's actual model involved lobbying for new zoning variances that would benefit Shaw's pre-existing holdings in those same corridors. He wanted my credibility and my investor relationships. In exchange, he was offering returns built on displacing the existing businesses he was publicly claiming to support. I read through the documents. They confirmed what he was describing in precise, damaging detail. So you pulled out. I pulled out and took 2 of his co-investors with me. The fund collapsed. Shaw Sr. spent the better part of 18 months rebuilding. Calloway finally sat, across the table from me. Declan is 3 years younger than I am, has been running point on rebuilding the family's reputation, and has apparently decided that compromising my ability to assess the Meridian acquisition clearly is the most efficient path forward. By compromising me, I said slowly, not just getting information, getting me implicated. If he can make it appear that you've been sharing confidential briefing materials with a potential acquisition target, the deal dies and my professional credibility takes damage that takes years to repair. His eyes held mine steadily. And if you're considered complicit, you lose your license and your career. The sophistication of it landed cold and clear. He wasn't courting me. He was constructing leverage. The dinner invitation, the claims about my misconduct. He wanted you off balance, curious, and motivated to share things you wouldn't otherwise share. Something tightened in his expression. The misconduct claims are fabricated. I can show you every transaction he would reference, and the full context behind each one. But I wanted you to hear that from me directly, before you saw any documentation, because I need you to make your own judgment about whether you believe me. I looked at him across the table. The man I'd watched for 18 months. How he treated the junior analysts who made mistakes. How he'd renegotiated a deal's terms when he'd realized a counterparty had been misled by their own advisors. How he kept a photograph of a Chicago neighborhood on his office wall that I'd eventually learned was the South Side block where he'd grown up. I believe you, I said, but I want to see the documentation anyway. The corner of his mouth moved. Good. You should. We spent the next 2 hours going through everything. He walked me through each transaction. Shaw would likely reference the full context, the paper trail. Edmund joined us midway through with additional records. By the time we were done, the fabricated misconduct narrative had no place to stand. What do we do about him? I asked. You respond to his dinner invitation. He said it without inflection. I stared at him. You want me to, with a wire, and Edmund at a table nearby, and my full legal team listening from a van on Wacker Drive. His expression was careful and controlled. You go to dinner. You let him make his offer explicitly. You let him make the misconduct claims on record, knowing what you know about their falsity. And then we hand everything to the SEC's Enforcement Division, which has been looking for a clean angle into Shaw Sr.'s operation for 2 years. You've been in contact with the SEC. I've been cooperating with them since last year. Shaw Meridian's practices didn't stop with the fund I walked away from. They got more careful, but the pattern continued. He met my eyes. I didn't tell you because it wasn't your concern until Declan made it your concern. I absorbed that, turned it over. If I do this, I said, I need you to tell me the things you've been deciding weren't my concern. All of them. I'm walking into a room with a man who's trying to destroy both our careers. I need complete information. Something shifted in his expression. Not the usual controlled shift, but something underneath it. Agreed, he said quietly. Edmund spent the next day preparing me. The wire was a small device adhered below my collarbone, invisible under the blouse I wore. Edmund walked me through signals, crossed arms if I felt threatened, touching my right earlobe if I needed them to move in. He was patient and thorough and completely without condescension, which I appreciated more than I said. Calloway watched all of it from the doorway of the conference room, his arms crossed, his expression tight. The evening before the dinner, after Edmund had left, and the building was quiet, he found me in the conference room, going through Shaw's publicly available financial disclosures. "You don't have to do this," he said from the door. I looked up. He'd taken off his jacket, rolled up his sleeves. It was such a small deviation from his usual precision that it registered as significant. "We've been through this. We've been through the operational version." He came into the room and sat across from me, which was not his usual mode. He stood when he was being strategic, sat when he was being honest. "I'm telling you now that you don't have to do this because I want it on record that you have a choice. Not because I think you'll choose differently, but because I need you to know it exists." "Why does that matter to you?" He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, it was in a different register than I'd ever heard from him before. "You drink your coffee black with 1 sugar. You tap your pen on the edge of your keyboard in 3s when you're working through a problem. You say with respect, right before you're about to completely disregard what I've asked you to do, which you've done 14 times in 18 months, and been correct at least 12 of those times." He looked at the table between us. "You wear the same dark gray blazer most Tuesdays because you've mentioned, once, 18 months ago, that you have an early morning standing call with your mother, and you want to look put together, but not like you tried. You've turned down 2 lateral opportunities I know of, because you said the work here was interesting. And I've spent more time than I should trying to determine whether that was fully true." The silence that followed that was enormous. "Calloway, I'm aware that this is not appropriate," he said. "I'm aware of the power dynamic and the professional implications, and the approximately 17 reasons why someone in my position shouldn't have spent the last several months noticing everything I just described." His jaw tightened. "But you asked me to be honest with you, so there it is. That's why I'm telling you that you have a choice. Because you matter to me in a way that compromises my objectivity, and you deserve to make decisions about your own safety without my interference." I thought about 14 times I'd said with respect. About him counting. "You've been counting," I said. "Yes, how many times have I been wrong?" "Twice, both in the first 3 months, before you fully understood how the Meridian family structures their minority positions." I looked at the man across from me, brilliant and controlled, and apparently, quietly keeping track of me for longer than either of us had acknowledged. "I'm going to dinner tomorrow," I said, "not because you need me to, and not because I don't have a choice. Because I've been sitting at the edge of your world for 18 months, and I understand what's at stake in it, and I'm choosing to help protect it." I held his gaze. "And when this is done, we're going to have a conversation about everything you just said." He looked at me for a long moment. Then he nodded once. "Agreed, and Calloway." I kept my voice steady. "Stop calling me Ms. Ward." The restaurant was in River North, the kind of place with no sign on the door, and a 3-month reservation wait, where the lighting was warm enough to make everyone look like they had secrets worth keeping. Edmund was at a corner table, with a woman from the legal team, both of them performing deep conversation with impressive commitment. The wire under my blouse was so light I'd almost forgotten it was there. Declan Shaw was handsome in the way of someone who'd had access to the right resources for exactly long enough. Good suit, easy posture, a smile that arrived before his eyes did. He stood when I approached and said my name like we were old friends, which we weren't. "I'm glad you came," he said. "I was worried my approach might have been too direct. It was definitely unusual." I settled into my seat. "I'm still deciding how I feel about it." "Fair enough." His smile widened slightly. "I find that subtlety is overrated when someone is worth the effort." We ordered drinks. He asked about my work, carefully, strategically, in the manner of someone who already knew the answers and was testing whether I'd give him the real ones. I answered the way I'd prepared, accurate but uninformative, watching him recalibrate each time I didn't give him the response he'd set up for. "You've been with Hargrove Capital a long time," he said eventually, leaning in slightly. "Longer than most people manage. The work is interesting. He repeated it the way he'd clearly been planning to. That's one word for it. Another word might be complicated, given some of what I've come to understand about the firm's practices. Here it was. I kept my expression curious rather than guarded. What have you come to understand? That Callaway Hargrove has a way of moving capital through structures that look entirely legitimate on the surface, but serve purposes that wouldn't survive regulatory scrutiny. He said it with the practiced confidence of someone delivering a prepared argument. I have documentation, Tessa. Things I think you'd want to see. Things that would change how you see the man you've been protecting. You've said that, I said. In your texts. And I meant it. He reached into his jacket and produced a thumb drive, slid it across the table. Everything is on there. Transaction records, internal communications, a pattern that goes back 5 years. I'm not asking you to do anything with it. I just want you to have the full picture. I looked at the drive, didn't touch it. Why? I asked. Why do you care whether I have the full picture? Because you're clearly intelligent, and intelligent people deserve accurate information. He settled back, smooth and assured. And because I think, if you saw the truth about who you work for, you might be open to a different conversation. About what you know, what you've processed in your role, and whether there's a mutually beneficial way to share some of that information with people who'd compensate you fairly. There it was. All of it, explicit and recorded. You want to pay me for confidential information about my employer's operations. He blinked, just slightly. I want to compensate you for insights that the market should have access to. Declan, I said his name calmly. That's what you're describing. Payment for confidential information. I just want us to be precise about it. He recovered quickly. He was good at that. What I'm describing is a correction to a power imbalance. Hargrove has made a practice of. I know what you think Hargrove has made a practice of, I said. And I've reviewed enough of your family firm's history to understand what this conversation is actually about. I pushed the thumb drive back across the table. I'd like you to know that I believe every word of what you've told me, and I'd like you to know that I'm not interested. He stared at me. I think we're done here, I said, and stood. The door opened before I reached it. Callaway came in first, which I hadn't expected. Then 2 people in professional attire I recognized from the firm's general counsel's office, followed by a man and a woman with federal credentials who introduced themselves to Declan in quiet, professional voices while he sat very still and the easy confidence drained out of his face like water. Callaway's eyes found mine immediately. He didn't say anything. He crossed the room, stopped in front of me, and looked at me like he was checking something he'd been worried about for hours. All right, he said. Fine. I held his gaze. You should know he's better at this than most people would be. I know. A muscle moved in his jaw. Edmund was listening. You were better. They led Declan out. The restaurant rearranged itself around the absence of drama, the way expensive places do. Callaway and I stood in the middle of the dining room, while the legal team conferred in the corner, and the silence between us was the most comfortable silence I'd experienced in a very long time. It's done? I asked. The enforcement division has what they need. Shaw Sr.'s operation has 3 other threads being pulled simultaneously. He was quiet for a moment. It ends here. Good. I let out a breath. You owe me a weekend somewhere without a wire. Something happened to his expression. Something warm and unguarded that I'd never seen before, that looked like relief and something larger underneath it. Wherever you want, he said. We ended up not going away that weekend. There were depositions, documentation requests, 3 meetings with the SEC's enforcement team that ran long and required every record I'd ever touched. Callaway sat in on all of them, not because he was required to, but because he'd told me, plainly, without ceremony, that he wasn't interested in letting me handle the fallout of something he'd pulled me into without being present for every piece of it. That was when I understood the difference between protection that diminishes and protection that stands beside you. We had the conversation I'd promised we'd have on a Wednesday evening 3 weeks later, in his office after everyone else had gone home, the Chicago skyline going dark. Through the windows I'd trained myself not to look at. I need to tell you something, he said. He was sitting across from me rather than behind his desk, which he'd started doing in the weeks since the dinner, and I'd noticed without mentioning it. Tell me. When Declan's texts arrived, when he claimed I'd been moving money through structures that wouldn't survive scrutiny, My first reaction wasn't concern about the investigation or the deal. He looked at the window. It was about what you would think, whether you would believe it. I've spent a significant amount of time building something I consider defensible in an industry that makes that difficult, and in that moment the only version of the question that felt urgent was yours. I let that settle. That's either a very good sign or a significant operational vulnerability, I said. The corner of his mouth moved. Edmund suggested the latter. Edmund's not wrong, no. He met my eyes. He's also not the person I'm in love with. The word sat in the room between us, solid and unambiguous. That's a significant thing to say, I said. I'm aware. I've been drafting it for approximately 6 weeks. A pause. It's not better with more time. I don't think you need to draft it, I said. I think you just needed to say it. I held his gaze. I'm in love with you too, for the record. I've been trying to determine the appropriate professional mechanism for that information for about 4 months. He looked at me like I'd just shown him a discrepancy in a model he'd thought was clean. Like the world had reorganized itself into a more accurate configuration. We need to handle the conflict of interest, he said, which was not what I'd expected him to say next, and which was so entirely him that something in my chest opened up. I know. I have some thoughts on that. So do I. I'd like yours first. I transition out of direct reporting to you. Build an independent consulting practice. I have the client relationships and the track record. Hargrove Capital becomes one client rather than my employer. We maintain professional boundaries that actually hold up. I watched his face. And we're honest about what we are. To the people who work here, to the board, to whoever needs to know. No ambiguity. He nodded slowly. I was going to propose something similar. I'd add that whatever threats remain from the Shaw situation, we address together. No more decisions made unilaterally, because I've decided something isn't your concern. Agreed. And if you ever describe yourself as making me safe, by pushing me out of your life again, I'll remind you that I've sat through 3 federal depositions on your behalf, and my threat tolerance is significantly higher than you seem to think. He laughed. It was a real laugh, not the controlled near smile I'd catalogued over 18 months, and it changed his face completely. Noted, he said. We built it slowly after that. The consulting practice, the renegotiated professional relationship, the private one we stopped pretending wasn't what it was. It wasn't seamless. There were weeks when the Shaw depositions consumed everything. Months when the market moved in ways that required him to be unreachable for days at a time. Moments when the complicated architecture of his world pressed in close enough that I had to remind myself I'd chosen it with full knowledge. But that was the thing I'd understood in that conference room, when he'd told me I had a choice and clearly hoped I'd choose to stay. I had chosen it. Not because I didn't understand the risk, but because I did, and I decided the risk was worth accepting. That's different from love as accident. Love as something that happens to you. This was love as something I'd walked toward with my eyes open, knowing exactly what I was walking into. 8 months after the Shaw case closed, Calloway and I flew to Savannah for a long weekend. No depositions, no wire, no security protocols beyond Edmund's very thorough advance work, which I'd insisted he not tell me about in detail. We walked along the waterfront on the first evening, and he held my hand with the same quality of attention he brought to everything. Completely, deliberately, like it was a decision rather than a habit. You never told me, he said. That first morning in the conference room when I told you about Shaw, you said you believed me before you'd seen any documentation. He looked at the water. What made you certain? I thought about 18 months of watching him. The South Side photograph on his wall. The way he'd told a junior analyst that he preferred to understand errors rather than just correct them. The 2 seconds of silence that always meant something worth hearing. You told me to make my own judgment, I said. People who are deceiving you don't do that. He was quiet for a moment. You're remarkably good at reading things that aren't obvious. It's what you pay me for. I looked up at him. Less so now, given the restructured arrangement. What I pay you for professionally, he corrected, has always been the lesser part of what I value about you. I stopped walking. He turned to face me, and the Savannah evening light made him look different than the Chicago office light ever had. Less controlled, more present, more like the version of himself I'd come to know in the months since we'd stopped maintaining the professional distance, neither of us had actually managed to maintain anyway. "You know," I said, "when you listed all the things you'd noticed about me, the Tuesday blazer, the coffee, the pen tapping." I held his gaze. "You missed one." "What did I miss?" "That every time you came out of a meeting that had gone badly, you stood at the window for exactly 4 minutes before you were ready to talk to anyone." I watched his face. I used to time it. I figured out around month 6 that if I had a briefing ready and waited until the 4 minutes were up, the conversation was always more productive. A pause. I was paying attention too. Something moved through his expression, something deep and quiet and a little undone. "Tessa," he said. My name in his voice still did something to my nervous system that I suspected was not going to fade with time. "I know," I said, and I did. We stood there for a while, on the Savannah waterfront, with the evening going gold around us. Two people who'd spent a long time learning each other through glass and paperwork and careful professional distance, finally standing in the same place at the same time, without any of it between us. The risk had been real. The complications were ongoing. The world he operated in would never be entirely simple, and I'd stopped expecting it to be. But I'd chosen him knowing all of that, and he'd let me choose instead of choosing for me. That, I'd decided, was the only version of this I would have wanted.